Welcome to The Faithful Steward. This is a podcast all about sharing biblical wisdom and practical insights in order to help church leaders pursue and teach financial freedom as part of Christian discipleship. We believe this is a spiritual conversation, and this is a place where the church needs to lead the way in order to move our communities forward in how we steward God's resources. I'm your host, James Lenhoff, and I am so passionate about this conversation and helping leaders have the confidence to step into it. We believe that if we help people thrive financially and grow spiritually, it changes everything. And I am so excited to join you on this journey. This podcast is brought to you by Good Sense. If you'd like more information about what we're up to, you can go to our website at goodsensemovement.org. All right, let's get started with today's conversation. Today we're going to talk about the attitudes of a faithful steward. What are those core foundational ways of thinking that frame the way a faithful steward carries out their management of God's resources? You know, when I looked up the definition of attitude, it says this: a settled way of thinking or feeling about someone or something, typically one that is reflected in a person's behavior. And I love that framework. When we think about something in a certain way, our thought about that thing or that person is reflected in our behavior. Attitudes determine our behaviors. They determine the directions that we take, the decisions that we make. And so it is really important that we structure our attitudes around this idea of faithful stewardship. And the most foundational attitude that is going to be beat like a drum constantly on this podcast and everything that Good Sense does is that God owns it all. The most foundational attitude for a faithful steward is one of stewardship rather than ownership. We do not own any of this. It's all God's. And so it's all His to decide what to do with, how it should be managed, where it should go, what purposes it should be applied to and invested in. This is all His. And we're just here to manage it and to act in obedience when He asks us to do something with His resources. Jesus made very clear in Matthew 6 that we cannot serve both God and money, both God and mammon. This idea of mammon is actually more of a construct, like a framework, a mental assent to more, to comfort, to self-indulgence. This is a concept that actually Andy Crouch does an amazing job of unpacking in a book called The Life We're Looking For. I highly recommend it. But it is a beautiful way to understand why these things are in conflict with each other. That at the end of the day, we either are falling in love with mammon, with money, or we are falling in love with God. We either see money as our source of provision, our source of comfort, our source of indulgence and enjoyment, or we see God as our source of provision and our protector and our provider, and we see Him and personify Him as the one who is the source, or we personify mammon as the source. That is why Paul says to Timothy very clearly, the love of money is a root to all kinds of evil, because our heart can only really invest in love in one direction at a time. We can't serve or love both God and money simultaneously. Money becomes what we worship. Money becomes what we find our confidence in, what we find our identity in. And if we're not careful, we will go down that path. But an attitude that's critical for a faithful steward is this attitude of loving and serving God. And that attitude will by default pull us away from the love of money. What Jesus is calling us to here is to choose. Choose to love God. Because by default, if we are passionately pursuing our love and service of the King of the universe, we will by default then not be able to serve this kingdom of mammon, the kingdom of empire, this move into selfishness and self-indulgence. They're mutually exclusive. And so we're choosing as faithful stewards to step further into a passionate pursuit of loving God and loving others. Jesus tells us that where our treasure is, our heart will be also. And so if we are treasuring our stuff, if we are treasuring our status, our title in our career, we're treasuring our power, we're treasuring these things that are built around this system of money and mammon, we will find our heart attached to those things. But Jesus tells us that if our treasure is in heaven, if we store up our treasures in heaven, our heart follows it. Our heart is pulled to those places where our treasure is found. And so these are really critical foundational ideas for a faithful steward. We need to embed in our communities that we lead these concepts of faithful stewardship being rooted in stewardship rather than ownership, in this idea of serving and loving God rather than mammon, in recognizing treasure and where it's located, and that pulls our heart in those directions. These are all things you've probably taught around or taught about at times, but what we need to do is have this be a constant, recurring conversation in our communities so that it's a reminder for us to reorient our heart away from mammon towards God, to reorient our heart away from the treasures of stuff and comfort and self-indulgence, and orient our heart towards the treasures that are found in the service to the King. When we embed these characteristics into the conversation around discipleship, these are not just ideas around how to manage money. These are not just ways to get more generous or to give more money to certain causes. These are foundational understandings of who we are, who God is, and how we relate and interact with Him and with His kingdom. And so these need to be ongoing conversations in our community, because what flows out of them is Christlike character. When we orient our hearts away from ownership and towards the treasures found in heaven, all of a sudden, these things, these characteristics that we want so desperately in our communities get unlocked. I mean, think about it. We want our people to have a heart that is patient. And a faithful steward is patient. A faithful steward has an attitude of waiting, of being patient in the waiting, that we end up saving for things that we're going to buy rather than financing them all. We end up resisting the tendency to be impulsive and emotional in our spending because we've decided ahead of time how we're going to manage God's resources, and so we're patient in that management. We will wait for the right timing. We'll wait to have enough of God's resources to deploy in a certain direction rather than running ahead of that provision and getting ourselves upside down and tangled up in the use of debt. We want our people to be diligent in their work. We want them to serve by giving themselves away, investing themselves into others. We want them to show up with intentionality and focus. And when we are faithful stewards, we are giving ourselves into the things that we are showing up to work at because we recognize that we are doing this for the glory of God's kingdom. When we are generous with our giving, when we pay attention to carving out and protecting margin so that we can be obedient in our generosity, we find ourselves more confident. We see God's provision more clearly. We see Him show up as we give. I think of the story in 1 Kings where we see the widow that is giving up her resources for Elijah. And it turns out there's more than enough. Somehow, some way, God continues to provide more and more oil and flour. There's more. She has enough. She has abundance. It doesn't make sense. But a generous giver who's engaged in this as a faithful steward will discover that they can have confidence in God's provision, that they can step further into that sense of generosity because they know, they've seen it before. They've watched God show up in the past when they couldn't explain it. But now they have confidence that there is an abundance and they can share it. And when they share, they develop a heart for others. They become the people that we want them to be when we're calling them to come and invest in this outreach, to give themselves away in service to people who are in need, to show up for the community in ways of volunteerism and investing their lives in the lives of others. That just comes naturally to them. As they share themselves and God's resources liberally, as they invest themselves generously, both with their time and their talents and their treasures, they find themselves more compelled to care for others. They see others as worthy of that love. When we stay in this place of selfishness and self-indulgence, we tell ourselves stories that sound like, well, I'm taking care of myself. You go figure it out for yourself. You take care of you. I'll take care of me. But a faithful steward says, I have enough extra to share, and I see you as worthy of that extra. I will spend that extra on you because I see that God loves you, that Jesus died for you just as much as he did for me. There's an equality that's found in that Christian discipleship that is unlike anything else when we release it into the kingdom in this sense of lavish self-sacrifice and love. And we want all those things to be part of our community. In order for us to be able to do that as a community, we actually need people to practice faithful stewardship. This is not just an outflowing of Christian discipleship, that if we are following Jesus, we will be faithful stewards. I actually think it's the other way around. I think that if we teach people what it looks like to be faithful stewards and what those base attitudes are, they will follow Jesus more closely. They will get more and more intimate in their relationship with the King of the universe, because these behaviors, these attitudes that result in these behaviors will reinforce themselves. They actually feed on themselves in a really powerful and beautiful way. This is not an aspect of Christian discipleship. This is the practice of Christian discipleship lived out in our relationship with money. And so we need these foundational attitudes in order for the behaviors that we want to actually be available. If we are calling people to service, to generosity, to volunteerism, to self-sacrifice, without first establishing what these faithful stewardship models look like, what it looks like for us to be faithful stewards with our time and with our talents and with our resources, we will not actually see it happen. We can call it out in them all we want. We can tell them they should be doing it. We can be guilting them, even shaming them in a lot of ways in order to get them to act. And then we wonder why we keep beating our head against that wall because they're not doing it. I think it's because we've been putting the cart before the horse. We need to get to a place where this faithful stewardship drives Christian discipleship. It drives a closer relationship with Jesus. And when we embed this into our culture, when our community is talking this way, having these attitudes at the foundation of how they approach God's resources, the outflow is a deeper expression of Christian discipleship. It doesn't end with how we manage our money. It begins there. It starts with these attitudes, and the behaviors flow out of them. When we encounter a call to faithful stewardship, our natural reaction is joyous obedience, right? When we get to a place where this understanding of faithful stewardship gets unlocked, the behaviors are radically generous and wildly selfless, and they change the world. It starts with this conversation, and I encourage you to have it with your community. thank you so much for listening to the Faithful Steward podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes for links and other information that we mentioned in today's episode. Also, be sure to check out our website at goodsensemovement.org to get all the resources we offer churches to help equip them in teaching financial stewardship to their community. If you have any questions or any topics you want to make sure we cover on our show, you can email me at jameslenhoff@goodsensemovement.org. I'd love to hear from you. I hope you all have a great week. We'll talk to you next week.